So welcome to the London Business School Wheeler Institute for Business and Development COVID-19 series. Today, it's a great honor and pleasure to have with us Moisés Naím, one of the world's most renowned and important authors who has written about many interesting and relevant to today's world issues. Latin America, the lost decade of Latin America in the 80s, about the changing power across the world in a fascinating book, The End of Power. More recently, Moisés has written a book about 111 surprises for the 21st century. Now, Moisés Naím is very well known to all of you, or to most of you, so he doesn't need much of an introduction. Let me just say that he combines an amazing and actually quite diverse set of experiences. He has served as Minister of Industry and Trade in Venezuela in the 90s. Subsequently, he worked for the World Bank. Most importantly, this is how I came to know about him. He served as the editor of Foreign Policy when he took over. Foreign Policy was in decline, and during his tenure there as an editor of Foreign Policy became one of the most important journals on international relationships and economics. Now, I could speak endlessly about Moisés, but let me welcome you, Moisés, to our COVID-19 series at the Wheeler Institute. Let me thank you for taking the time. Moisés is joining us from Washington. There are many issues and topics that I want us to discuss. So my first question is, given your actually amazing, actually quite diverse experience and all the scenes, the aspects that you have seen so far, you have written this book, The End of Power. How do you see power in international relationships being affected by COVID?
Well, first of all, thank you, Elias. It's a pleasure being here. It's a pleasure talking to you. I look forward to this conversation. So thank you so much. I have been either as a participant or an observer of a lot of the crises that have gone, in the last. The world is crisis prone, and there are accidents, geopolitical, financial accidents frequently. What I have seen, and now have in mind, of course, the dot-com bubble when it burst. I have the 9/11, then the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, and now this. And what do they have in common? And I find that there are three basic commonalities to all of them. The first is that the reaction to the crisis touches more lives and has more consequences than the trigger, whatever triggered the crisis. I don't want to minimize the current trigger with the coronavirus, because this is big and different, it's global, it's quick, it's uncertain, and it has all of the reasons to be anxious and worried about it. But all I want to point out is that in past crises, in 9/11 and in the 2009, 2010 financial crisis, their reactions, what governments did as a reaction, touched more lives and changed more things than the trigger. That's one. The second is that there was always, in the past, I don't know now, but in the past, there was always an overestimation of the consequences. So changing the world is always the phrase. This is going to change the world forever for everyone and everything. Well, it didn't happen. Of course, there are changes, and after 9/11, going through past two airports changed the experience of traveling. Terrorism and wars became an issue. But the reality is that the percentage of humanity that was changed, that saw their daily lives changed profoundly by the events, is not a totality. It's not that the complete world changed. More things stay the same than what things have changed. And the third is that it's always surprising to see how institutions, ideas, ways of thinking, business models, government policies that we thought permanent became transient. And things that we thought that were passing became permanent. And I think we are going to see some of that now with this current pandemic, in which things that we started thinking that were temporary are going to become more permanent. And the iconic example of that is going to be teleworking. I think I'm not suggesting that after the crisis ends, everybody stays at home, but I think that a larger percentage of workers, or of office workers, will perform their duties from home and in rotations and in different settings and so on. And so that is something that we thought it was just going to be a short-term reaction to the coronavirus crisis, but I think some of it will stay with us.
Well, I wanted to also ask you, given your work and what you have been writing at Project Syndicate, I forgot to mention that Moises writes often for the leading Spanish and Italian newspaper, El País and La República. I see that you write a lot about international relations and about leadership. So I know that economists, and you hold a PhD from MIT, where I'm on visit this year, are really hard at making forecasts, but how do you see the COVID-19 affecting international relations? We already see a lot of animosity, for example, between China and the US, less so perhaps between Europe and China.
Yeah, there were trends and crises that preceded the COVID-19 that have been exacerbated by COVID-19 and will continue. And the largest one and the most important one is the most important bilateral relations in the world, which is between the United States and China. That was not going well before the virus, and it's not going well now. And the Trump administration clearly is using China as a theme, and it's going to become a theme in the electoral process in the United States. So there is the friction there is there. It was there and is mounting now, and it's going to be with us for a long time in different forms. It will take different manifestations, but it's going to be there.
And do you foresee that the tension will continue even if we see a change of leadership in the US?
It's going to be different, but yes, the frictions are structural and permanent. The kind of policies that China, as a communist country governed by a monolithic single party, still organized in a Leninist way, and that injected and combined and overlaid with high technology, communications technologies and IT and all of what we have seen of a modern age police state, which with a massive capacity for surveillance of citizens' behaviors, is going to be there, and the frictions are going to be there. And then, there's a competition. There's clearly a competition for control of raw materials, of manufacturing, of high technology, of data and information, the oceans, this outer space, you name it, and there is their rivalry and competition that are not going to go away depending on who is at the White House. I do believe that Trump has made things more complicated unnecessarily. I believe that the commercial war, the trade war that he initiated was a bad idea, badly implemented with bad consequences.
Yeah, so let me switch actually our focus, and given your earlier work and your experience, perhaps, the tweets of the US president or, the tensions in the Sino-American relationship is masking an emerging market crisis which is unfolding as we speak. So given your earlier work, and I know your interest in the area, can you please tell us what do you see the key challenges for emerging markets in the quarters, months, years to come?
You are correct, Elias, that we are facing an emerging market crisis, the likes of we have not seen in the past. Emerging markets are also very prone to accidents. I have joked in the past that emerging markets are like teenagers. They have a propensity to fall and break a bone and all of that. And so we have seen, we have been now educated by emerging markets that every few years there's a crash. It's either the Asian crisis or Russia or Latin America, and so on. So the, the, the ones we have seen over the years are there. So there is certain pattern, certain regularity to emerging markets crashing. The triggers are different, the context is different, the policy reactions are different, and the trajectory of the contagion is different. What we have seen is that these crises don't stay at home, they travel. And, you know, and you can see how a crisis in Brazil has consequences for Russia, even though their links, the economic connections between the two are very limited. So we are going to see more of that, but at a scale that has no precedent. And that is because before the COVID-19 and the economic consequences that we are already seeing, Latin America had pre-existing conditions that weakened its economies. Commodity prices were down, remittances that is, you know, and a lot of countries in Latin America depend critically from the remittances of their people working abroad that send to their families, access to credit, foreign direct investment, tourism, and essentially big time and centrally is the fall in demand and the falling prices of commodities. And what we just recently saw with oil, I think, is a final most impressive, surprising, unprecedented situation in which we, you know, for a few hours we saw price at negative. We saw oil being traded at negative prices because no one knew where to store it. So the storage crisis and all of that, the overproduction is there. And again, that's an industry that's going to change, but it illustrates the kinds of things that are happening. So Latin America is hit by this new crisis with weakening pre-existing conditions. The things were already bad in terms of the economies, and now are even worse because they need help, they need international help, they need markets, they need finance, they need credit, they need foreign investment, and all of that is going to be limited in the foreseeable future.
And also what I think, let me add, I concur with your assessment, and what is also quite interesting is that we know that emerging market crisis, we see contagion, for example, in 97, 98, when the Russian default quickly spread to Brazil. But now we have something like 100 countries, perhaps more, have stopped counting, seeking assistance from the IMF at exactly the same time. And I think this is unprecedented in the world. And if I was to further zoom on Latin America, and I know you come from Venezuela, you did your undergrad there, you served as minister, and you know, this was a country, as you pointed out, that even before COVID-19, you know, the situation, both politically and economically, was actually quite stressful. So how do you think, for example, playing out in Venezuela nowadays?
Venezuela is now a limit case. It's completely out of any prior experience. It is hard to extrapolate from it. It should not be extrapolated from the Venezuelan case to the rest of Latin America. Venezuela is a unique, tragic example. This is a country with the largest proven reserves of oil that does not have gasoline today. Today, if you want to fill your car with gasoline to go from A to B, there is no gasoline. The highest inflation in the world, the lowest, the biggest decline in GDP, the highest unemployment, the largest deficit of all kinds. So this is a tragedy. This is the wealth destruction of Venezuela has no precedence. We have seen wars, all-out wars that have caused less damage to a country's wealth and industrial base and institutional capacities like Venezuela. So it is an extreme case. It's not going to change anytime soon. It's unclear what change means. We all have this dream of having Venezuela back to being a democracy. Venezuela for many years was the longest democracy in the region. So we have that dream that one day you wake up and there is a government that is decent, that is not kleptocratic, and that is democratic and technocratic and can have the correct policies. Before we get there, we are going to see some bad events and not good news, unfortunately and sadly.
I see. So actually, an aspect that we're particularly interested in the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development, as our name implies, we're interested a lot of understanding the interplay between business and development, and especially once we start thinking about frontier economies, low-income countries, even emerging markets to some extent. Quite often in policy circles, businesses are considered either as irrelevant, so the focus is on policy, or in some parts of Africa, for example, business is considered to be part of the problem. So do you see a particular role of business in Latin America, but also more generally, as being a part of the solution and hopefully the recovery after COVID-19?
Well, yeah, what we have seen with COVID is the return of government in a lot of areas in which in recent decades government had retreated. And we saw that also in the crash of the 2009-2010 financial crash. We saw how there was a huge demand, political demand and popular demand of bring back the government with all of its massive capacity to intervene, and central banks intervention and all of that. We saw the return of government big time there, and we are seeing it now. We saw the United States, we're seeing the United States, you know, with a 14% of GDP intervention here. So yes, in this context, the private sector is does not have the leverage, the resources, the scope to intervene like the governments. But never forget that in a lot of these countries, the private sector is the provider of formal employment and is the provider of growth and dynamism and expertise. There are areas, one of the things that I think is going to change, at least for a while, as a result of this crisis, is the return of the need for competence and for technical prowess and for you know, we have had a lot of ineptitude, improvisation, bad management, and so there may be a renewal, a renaissance of appetites and desire to have competent people, even if they are from the private sector, running things. And I'm not suggesting that the people in the private sector are always better. And in fact, we are seeing some catastrophic examples of the private sector, you know, business people running public sector, and it's a debacle. So I am always very careful with just assuming that, you know, private sector people are competent and public sector managers are inept. That's not the case. But yes, and we are seeing also the private sector in some countries taking a more proactive social policy of their own. And they're responding to this need among workers in companies, in which they want their leaders to have a different compact with them. There is a transition in terms of mindset, expectations, rules of engagements within management and workers. The workers want, well, first, it has to be said that the private sector in these countries everywhere now has three objectives: liquidity, liquidity, and liquidity. Everyone is building liquidity because everyone is afraid there will be liquidity impairment moments in coming future. But after having said that, from a purely business point of view, there is a lot of expectation and need of solidarity. People that work at companies want to feel that their leaders have solidarity with them, which is closely associated with empathy. That they are leaders that know what is happening to the workers, that live in the same context and can put themselves there and therefore behave in ways that are more influenced by empathy. And then they want truth, both in government leadership and in private sector. I think there's a demand for just tell me the truth. Don't manipulate, don't obfuscate, don't hide, don't lie. And I think I see that in the private sector also there is a huge demand for leaders that are more transparent.
So I like that: solidarity, empathy, truth. I think it's a positive message going forward. And I also like your optimism that perhaps there's going to be a return to competence that we have seen actually being damaged, especially in the years after the 2008, 2010 global financial crisis. So Moses, let me follow up on your remark about the return to competency and the need of people to get the truth. So actually we met on a conference on populism, and thinking about populism, I can see of the following now trade-off. On the one hand, we tend to search for truth, the good scientists, the good leaders that communicate well with the people, and perhaps this pushes populists down. But on the other hand, inequality, as we know, or the tentative evidence suggests that it is increasing. The secular trends, as you pointed out in your very initial remark, perhaps continue. The role of social media is far from clear. So it's a bit unclear which of the two forces, the one that will push populists down and the other one that will increase their popularity, which of the two will dominate. So I wanted your view on that.
That's a very accurate insight and evaluation. I share that perspective. The only thing I would add is that the challenge, the big problem we have is not just populism, is when populism stays for long, is the debacle with governments that are very bad and somehow manage to raise term limits. So a country like Venezuela, for example, could have survived 5 years of bad government from Hugo Chavez. What it could not survive is 2 decades, more than 2 decades of bad populism. So the problem is not populism, the problem is what in Spanish we call continuismo, which is the continuity of the populist in governments and erasing and disappearing, undermining term limits and the checks and balances of democracy that contains the bad policies. So the fight ought to be not just to denounce populism, very often correctly, but insist on term limits and protect the checks and balances that limit populist leaders of doing whatever they want and wreaking havoc in the economy, society, and so on.
So related to that, I think, Moses, that you wrote a piece with a very provocative title. I think it was 2 Ps, 3 Ps. Can you please explain?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that if you go around the world and see politics around the world, you see the 3 Ps at work: populism, polarization, and post-truth. Populism we have always had, but now it's more global. It takes different manifestations, and it has different consequences in many ways, and similar consequences, bad ideas that continue to be embraced by leaders. And populism is a good example of that. So that's populism. Then there is polarization. Countries have had always polarization, polarized around race and religion and socioeconomic status, and all societies have divisions and wedges, and leaders that are populist tend to use those and expand the polarization and the divisions and the wedge issues that become central to the national conversation, and that block governments. The polarization makes it very hard for governments to function, even to create governments. We have seen what has happened in Spain, in Belgium, in England, in Israel, in Italy, in which you have these very strange alliances and governments that have a very hard time creating sufficient power to govern. And then you have the post-truth. The 3rd P is post-truth, is this world in which we don't know who to believe, what to believe, who to read, who to follow, and how to understand what's going on. So these 3 Ps are being used around the world by bad leaders to get power and sustain and retain power.
Moses, thank you deeply for taking the time to be with us. It's an honor and pleasure for us to share your insights. Thanks again, and we look forward also reading you at your regular column. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Elias. This was fun, and I hope to see you again soon. All the best.
Thank you.